بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم
Allahu Akbar, Allahu Akbar. Allahu Akbar, Allahu Akbar. Ashhadu an la ilaha illallah. أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله أشهد أن محمدا رسول الله أشهد أن محمدا رسول الله حي على الصلاة حي على الصلاة حي على الفلاح حي على الفلاح الله أكبر الله أكبر لا إله إلا الله
أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له وأشهد أن محمدا عبده ورسوله أما بعد فأعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. The first verse I'm going to recite is from chapter 49, verse 10. إنما المؤمنون إخوة فأصلحوا بين أخويكم واتقوا الله لعلكم ترحمون. The believers are brothers, so make peace between your brothers and keep your duty to Allah, that mercy may be had on you. The next is chapter 3. I will only read 2 verses, but I will translate the 4, which this is verse 101 to 102 to 105. I will translate. يا أيها الذين آمنوا اتقوا الله حق تقاته ولا تموتن إلا وأنتم مسلمون واعتصموا بحبل الله جميعا ولا تفرقوا واذكروا نعمة الله عليكم إذ كنتم أعداء فألف بين قلوبكم فأصبحتم بنعمته إخوانا وكنتم على شفا حفرة من النار فأنقذكم منها كذلك يبين الله لكم آياته لعلكم تهتدون. O you who believe, keep your duty to Allah as it ought to be kept, and die not unless you are Muslims. Notice one thing. It says, O you who believe. So there is a difference between simply believing and being real Muslims, as the Quran demands of us, or the Holy Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and hold fast by the covenant of Allah all together, and be not disunited, and remember Allah's favor to you when you were enemies. Then He united your hearts, so by His favor you became brethren. And you were on the brink of a pit of fire, then He saved you from it. Thus Allah makes clear to you His messages, that you may be guided. And from among you, there should be a party who invite to good and enjoin the right and forbid the wrong. And these are they who are successful. And be not like those who became divided and disagreed after clear arguments had come to them. And for them is a grievous chastisement. And the last one is chapter 21, verse 92. Inna hazihi ummatukum ummatan wahidatan wa ana rabbukum fa'budun. Surely your community is a single community. Ummatukum ummatan wahidatan. You are a single community, and I am your Lord, and serve me. I have recited these verses, and it will probably take 2, maybe 3 khutbahs to cover this topic. But, Sadaqallahul Aliyyul Azim. And this topic came to mind when I saw a report. And let me, before I go into the report, let me read some hadiths related to this as well. The Holy Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam said, 3 things are the best acts. First, treat people with equity and justice. Second, to assist your co-religionist brethren as fellows and aid them financially. And third, to remember God under all conditions. Have you noticed something? The best act is to treat people. There is no mention of religion, there's no mention of sect, there's no mention of anything. And that the fact that this means humanity, you can see from the second act, assist your co-religionists as fellows, and so on. This is Bihar al-Anwar, volume 74, page 392. And then the Holy Prophet said that he who begins his day without endeavoring for the improvement of Muslims' affairs is no Muslim. such emphasis did the Holy Quran and the Holy Prophet Muhammad put on Muslims being united and helping each other, but helping everyone as well, to treat people with equity and justice. It doesn't say Muslims. That comes second. And these came to mind when I saw a report by War on Want, which said that Israel was an apartheid state. And I looked at the Muslim press. Forget about the Western press. They mentioned it briefly in news items and then carried on. But there was deafening silence from the Muslim media, from the Muslim politicians, from the Muslim imams, in support of their Palestinian brothers and sisters who are going through such hard times, as they have been since 1949. Not only 1949, but since early days of the last century, when the British took over Palestine. Deafening silence. And guess who has spoken up? Who has tried to make this report widely available? The only community that has spoken out in support of the Palestinian rights has been the Lahore Ahmadiyya community. Let us start by seeing what apartheid is. It's an Afrikaans word. Afrikaans is the language used in South Africa, which means separateness. And this is what was the expression, the word used to describe the racial discrimination and the system of government, etc., in South Africa until 1994, when it was dissolved. But even then, it was interesting that when the whole world condemned South Africa for apartheid on the basis of color, hardly anyone denounced Israel for apartheid on the basis of religion. But this report says the term apartheid is not only a reference to South Africa's former regime, it is used in international law to describe a category of regime defined in the United Nations International Convention on the suppression and punishment of the crime of apartheid, to which more than 100 states are a party. This definition was refined in Article 7 of the Rome Statute of International Criminal Court. And you know something? United States and Israel, they refused to sign these protocols. Why is that, I wonder? The Rome Statute defines the crime of apartheid as inhumane acts committed in the context of an institutionalized regime of systematic oppression and domination by one racial group over any other racial group or groups, and committed with the intention of maintaining that regime. So, why is Israel an apartheid state? There is overwhelming evidence that the system instituted by the Israeli governments against the Palestinian people meets this definition that I just read out, this definition by United Nations. In effect, Israel and the occupied Palestinian territory constitutes one territorial unit under full Israeli control. So from the Mediterranean to River Jordan, that is all Israel. And from the north, Lebanon, part of which has been occupied by Israel, Syria, part of which has been occupied and made a part of Israel, down to Gaza. Israel and occupied Palestinian territory constitute one territorial unit under full Israeli control. Palestinians constitute around half of the total population, that is, in Israel and the occupied territories. Yet under Israeli law and in practice, Jewish Israelis and Palestinians are treated differently in almost every aspect of life: housing, education, health, employment, family life, residence, freedom of movement. Talking about health, you remember when Israelis said that the Jews will be vaccinated first, and they're not going to vaccinate Muslims or Arabs? Dozens of Israeli laws and policies institutionalize this prevailing system of racial discrimination and domination by the Jews. Segregation is carried out by implementing separate legal regimes for Jewish Israelis and Palestinians living in the same area. In the occupied West Bank, Jewish Israeli settlers living in illegal settlements are governed by Israeli civil law, while Palestinians living in the same area on the West Bank of Jordan, what law applies to them? Military law. The Jews are living in illegal settlements. Civilian law applies to them. Palestinians are lawfully there in their villages and towns and so on. But military law applies to them. In Israel itself, forget about the occupied territory. There is no Israeli nationality which everyone shares as citizens. Whether you're a Jew or a non-Jew, you live in that state, so you're Israeli. That concept doesn't exist. Rather, citizens are divided into categories of Jewish, which affords them a set of rights and privileges above the other categories, or Arab, with comparatively restricted rights and privileges. This is never brought up in general in newspapers and so on. This separation was enforced when Israel passed the national state law in 2018, essentially codifying decades of discrimination and enshrining two classes of citizens in law. No one screamed in the West. No one screamed in the Muslim world. And then we blame others for the state of affairs that we find ourselves in. Israel carries out acts that are prohibited by the UN Apartheid Convention. Forcible transfer of Palestinians to make way for illegal Israeli settlements. Preventing Palestinians from returning to their homes and lands, including millions of refugees living in exile. Systematic and severe deprivation of fundamental human rights of Palestinians based on their identity, based on their racial identity. Denying Palestinians their right to freedom of movement and residence, especially but not limited to Palestinians in the Gaza Strip. And listen to this: murder, torture, unlawful imprisonment, and other severe deprivation of physical liberty. The whole of occupied Palestine appears to be an example of one of the Nazis' concentration camps, with the exception that Palestinians are shot to death and they're not forced to go into gas chambers. We are told, and there were heinous crimes committed by the Nazis. But I ask the world, what about the crimes against Palestinians that are being committed? The governments in the West talk about freedom of expression and the right of anyone to choose to live where they want to own a home, to education, to employment. Where are these rights for the Palestinians, for the Arabs? The world remained silent when Israel said, we are going to vaccinate the Jews. Let the Arabs die. They want them to die so that they become a minority in their own land. It seems odd to me that European and American and Russian Jews, remember we're not talking about inhabitants of Palestine itself, who migrated to Palestine. How long ago? Since the First World War. But in numbers after the Second World War, from 1947 onwards. Everyone argues that they have a right to occupy and live in that state called Israel. But those who've been displaced, the Palestinian Arabs, no one argues for them. What about their rights to live in the land that they and their ancestors occupied for thousands of years? These Johnny-come-latelys, they have a right to live in Israel. But these people who live there in Palestine for thousands of years, they don't have that right. People say, shame on the world, but I say, shame on Muslims. Why should the world care about you and do anything for you when you yourself are not prepared to look after your own interests, to look after your brethren? I'm setting the ground for the last khutbah, which will probably be the second or the third khutbah. So this is an introduction. Barakallahu lana wa lakum fil Qur'anil azim wa nafa'ana wa iyyakum bil ayati wa zikril hakim innahu ta'ala jawadun karimun malikun barrahur rahim. Alhamdulillah. Alhamdulillah nahmaduhu wa nasta'inuhu wa nastaghfiruhu wa nu'minu bihi wa natawakkalu alayhi wa na'udhu billahi min shururi anfusina wa min sayyiati a'malina wa man yahdihillahu fala mudilla lahu wa man yudlilhu fala hadiya lahu. Ashhadu an la ilaha illallah wa ashhadu anna Muhammadan abduhu wa rasuluh. Allahumma salli ala Muhammadin wa ala ali Muhammadin kama sallaita ala Ibrahim wa ala ali Ibrahim innaka Hamidum Majid. Allahumma barik ala Muhammadin wa ala ali Muhammadin kama barakta ala Ibrahim wa ala ali Ibrahim innaka Hamidum Majid. Allahumma ansur man nasara dina Muhammadin sallallahu alayhi wa sallam waj'alna minhu. واخذل من خذل دين محمد صلى الله عليه وسلم ولا تجعلنا منهم. عباد الله رحمكم الله إن الله يأمر بالعدل والإحسان وإيتاء ذي القربى وينهى عن الفحشاء والمنكر والبغي يعظكم لعلكم تذكرون. اذكروا الله يذكركم وادعوه يستجب لكم ولذكر الله أكبر والله يعلم ما تصنعون. Ready?
Yep.
Allahu Akbar, Allahu Akbar. Ashhadu an la ilaha illallah, ashhadu anna Muhammadar Rasulullah. Hayya ala salah, hayya ala falah, qad qamatis salat, qad qamatis salat. Allahu Akbar, la ilaha illallah. Allahu Akbar. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Ar-Rahmanir Rahim. Maliki Yawmiddin. Iyyaka na'budu wa iyyaka nasta'in. Ihdinas siratal mustaqim. صراط الذين أنعمت عليهم غير المغضوب عليهم ولا الضالين. آمين. تبت يدا أبي لهب وتب ما أغنى عنه ماله وما كسب سيصلى نارا ذات لهب وامرأته حمالة الحطب في جيدها حبل من مسد. الله أكبر. سمع الله لمن حمده.
ربنا
الله أكبر. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. Allahu Akbar. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Ar-Rahmanir Rahim. Maliki Yawmiddin. إياك نعبد وإياك نستعين. اهدنا الصراط المستقيم. صراط الذين أنعمت عليهم غير المغضوب عليهم ولا الضالين آمين. قل هو الله أحد الله الصمد لم يلد ولم يولد ولم يكن له كفوا أحد. الله أكبر. سمع الله لمن حمده
ربنا
الله أكبر. الله أكبر. اللهم اغفر لي وارحمني. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله. استغفر الله استغفر ربنا آتنا في الدنيا حسنة وفي اليوم القيامة. Thank you for joining us for our Friday service. We'll continue with this topic, as I said, the next week and perhaps the week after as well. And please, in our prayers, pray for Muslims to unite together and look after their own interest and stop blaming others for exploiting them or not looking after their interest. With the prayer that whoever you are and wherever you may be, may Allah keep all of you safe and sound and free from harm. Assalamu alaikum. Khuda Hafiz. Goodbye.